China's film industry is on the verge of becoming the world's largest movie market. Box office revenues hit a record high in 2015, and Hollywood produced more movies specifically for the Chinese market. Hello, I'm Nathan King, filling in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. China's movies ticket sales have reached close to $7 billion last year. Industry experts say China is on track to become the world's largest film market within the next couple of years. Several Hollywood studios have partnered with Chinese production houses, and recently the Dalian Wonder Group bought a majority stake in the US movie studio Legendary Entertainment. DreamWorks also released its first Hollywood-China co-production of its beloved Panda franchise. On January 29th, DreamWorks and Shanghai's Oriental DreamWorks released Mandarin and English versions simultaneously of the animated feature film Kung Fu Panda 3.
I'm looking for my son.
我叫李山.
You lost your son?
Yes.
你找不到儿子了。
是啊。
Creative teams from Shanghai and Los Angeles worked together for 2.5 years to create an industry first. Animators meticulously designed an authentic Chinese village, modified mouth movements of their characters, and tailored puns specifically for Chinese audiences. The movie earned a record $57 million in the first 3 days of its premiere in China and $41 million in its opening weekend in the US. Joining us now from Beijing is James Fong. He's the CEO of Oriental DreamWorks, the Chinese-American film production company involved in the creation of Kung Fu Panda 3. James, thanks so much for joining us. First of all, why was Kung Fu Panda 3 so successful on its opening in China?
Well, thank you so much, Nathan, for having me on the show. So Kung Fu Panda has a very long legacy. It's a very well-beloved character here in China. It started in 2008 with Kung Fu Panda 1, and then an amazing opening with Kung Fu Panda 2. So Kung Fu Panda 3 is actually a carryover of that particular legacy. And I think what we've done for Kung Fu Panda 3 that's so unique amongst all the other Panda franchises and other animation is we've done a tremendous amount of effort. We made a lot of investments trying to make Kung Fu Panda 3 as uniquely Chinese as possible. And one of the things that we've done that's so amazing is we actually created 2 versions of the movie. One version in English with Chinese subtitles. The other one is it's a complete version of Kung Fu Panda and Mandarin, right down to the lip sync and the Chinese voice actors.
The key word I heard from Kung Fu Panda 3 is authenticity. Even people who like 1 and 2 just saw a huge jump between Kung Fu Panda 1 and 2 and 3 because of what you're describing. How did this all come together?
What we do is it's an effort where we really want to make sure the audience wins. For us, both the Chinese team and the American team, we work collaboratively together trying to figure out exactly what we think the Chinese audience would love to see. For example, one of the things that we've done in our studio in China is we work very closely with our American studio to make sure that all the design elements are authentic. Many of the landscape map paintings, a lot of the character designs, the set design pieces are all designed by our staff here in Oriental DreamWorks here in Beijing to go ahead and make sure that the authenticity of it, down to the costumes and everything, is as closely to the authenticity as possible. The other thing that we've done is we went ahead and created entirely new Chinese dialogue for the movie, because we want to make sure that the audience is not just looking at a translated version of the dialogue, but a real authentic dialogue between the characters in Mandarin. So that's one of the things we have. We had director Teng Huatao, who's a Chinese director, as well as Ding Ding, who is a Chinese screenwriter, to do both to complete that particular version for us. And then with director Teng, we went ahead and were able to recruit amazing Chinese talents such as Jay Chou, Jackie Chan, Huang Lei, Yang Mi, and others to go ahead and be the character voices for Kung Fu Panda 3.
Yeah, I even heard that Jackie Chan was told to keep his accented Mandarin because that added authenticity. And that there was this back and forth about what Americans thought was Chinese, but Chinese people said, no, 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 like the ribbon dance with the panda. Was there lots of misunderstandings from Americans when it comes to Chinese culture?
You know, I don't think there's any confusion. I think if anything, the Chinese audience really loved the fact that we not only look at Chinese kung fu from a martial arts perspective, but also from a philosophical perspective. I think a lot of the things about the movie it really espouses and it embodies a lot of the spirit or the values that's associated with Chinese martial arts and the Chinese culture. And I think that's one of the things that the Chinese audiences have gravitated in so well to this particular movie.
James, let's widen this out, because this sort of collaboration on this film, of course, is part of a pattern that we're seeing of more collaboration between China and Hollywood and vice versa. What's behind it?
Well, I think a lot of it is, I can't speak for other studios, but for us, it's about the discovering and unmining the Chinese myth and stories. I think one of the things that both of our investors from DreamWorks, Jeffrey Katzenberg from DreamWorks and Mr. Li Ruigang from China Media Capital, have a strong belief that there are so many stories in China that's yet to be told, and to be told in a way that can both be appreciated by the audience in China and around the globe. That was the original genesis, if you will, of our joint venture, is to unmine all these amazing stories and to bring it to audiences on both sides of the Pacific.
What you're saying is really interesting, because Hollywood is desperate to get hold of the Chinese market. It's the biggest growing box office market in the world. They can see a lot of profit there, a huge market. But also, you're talking about Chinese stories having to be told, not just Hollywood, and the rest of the world. Is this a meeting of minds when it comes to the global media industry, especially in movies?
Well, I think, in the last year, I think there's been a huge change, or at least visibly there's a change in the China market. Because prior to this, there's a lot of discussion about the top 10 Chinese box offices tend to be Western movies. I think in the last year, that number has actually decreased. So the movies, for example, if you take the last 12 to 18 months, of the 3 movies that have broken the 2 billion RMB box office, 2 of them are Chinese movies, and only 1 is a Western movie. That's Furious 7. And then the 2 Chinese, one is Monster Hunt, that was done in last July, and you have Mermaid, that just happened over the Chinese New Year. I think it goes to show that the Chinese audiences prefer, or at least in this particular context, a equal appetite for Chinese content as well as a certain appetite for Western content. So I think that changes the dynamics quite a bit.
So James, sorry to interrupt, but what does Hollywood then have to do to make sure its Chinese audiences are satisfied, like Kung Fu Panda 3, but on an increasingly wider scale?
I think for Hollywood, they need to really think about what kind of movie translates without a lot of localization. For example, your action movies doesn't require a lot of localization, so that may play well globally. However, when you start talking about things that requires more story, that requires a little bit more depth than just action or special effects, then Hollywood really need to think about what would resonate, what story would really resonate with the Chinese audience. There's a lot of background that the Chinese audiences may not have that Hollywood may think they would have. So, a lot of the Chinese did not grow up the way that other audiences did in Japan or in the US or in Europe. They have a very unique a growing experience in the 70s, 80s, and even in the 90s. So how would Hollywood think about making those stories that resonate with these audiences across such a different cultural and cultural divide, in addition to be able to attract audiences that are behaviorally very different, that are in a bigger city than they are in a smaller or rural cities.
A tough market to crack, but also China trying to obviously get into the US market as well and globally. What lessons does China's film industry have to learn going forward as it continues to partner with Hollywood and beyond?
I think there's a couple things. So number one, I think the Chinese filmmakers and Chinese studios need to understand the mechanics of how films are successful especially in the United States, the biggest market right now in the world. You know, there's a very specific script around 3 acts. There's a certain beliefs around character development and character arcs that's associated in a movie that's successful. So those are something that I think are something that fundamentally the filmmakers in China need to understand. And in addition, just like the Hollywood trying to understand what resonates with the Chinese audience, I think it's very important that the Chinese studio, the Chinese filmmakers, also have an appreciation for the things that will work in the U.S., but that may not work in China or vice versa. They need to have a very intuitive thinking around that. And that, I think, can be germane from a lot of these mutual collaboration that you're seeing right now between our studios in China and the U.S. and other collaborations between Hollywood and China.
What's behind the growth in China in terms of the market, and what do you tell your American colleagues about what to look for? You know, we are seeing Chinese movie-going exploding, especially among the young.
Yes, yes. You know, I think there's a couple factors. First of all, it's just sheer numbers. So to just give you an example, like at the end of 2014, I haven't updated my number for 2015 yet, but in 2014, you know, the number of screens per million people in China is around 18. But in the U.S., it's around 123. In Korea, South Korea, it's around 44. So just the number of screens per capita, per millions of people, there's a tremendous amount of growth that's happening. And so China is adding a lot of screens to meet that particular demand. And so I think that's definitely one of the driving factors. I think the second driving factor is the fact that there's an increased disposable income around the middle class. In China, China's per capita income is increasing, so people have more disposable income. And they want to have a nice Friday night or Saturday night entertainment. And what better place to go do that than go see a movie?
James Fong, we look very much forward to seeing what Oriental DreamWorks has in the pipeline after the success of Kung Fu Panda 3. Thanks so much for joining us. Next, we'll speak with 2 film producers behind many successful Hollywood-China collaborations. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back to The Heat. Joining us now from San Francisco is Janet Young. She's a Golden Globe and Emmy-winning producer behind such films as Shanghai Calling, Dark Matter, and The Joy Luck Club. Also with us from Los Angeles is Peter Xiao. He is the founder and CEO of Orb Media Group and founder and chairman of the US-China Film Summit. Welcome to you both. Fascinating discussion. Janet, I want to start with you. You know, you have worked on a lot of these crossovers. You're ahead of the curve. Do you think there's this new trend in this co-production between Hollywood and China?
I think for many of us, we saw it as an inevitable trend. There is so much going on in China. The market is booming, and yet there's so many wonderful resources in Hollywood that are frankly underutilized at this point because there are fewer and fewer films being made here. So many of us believe that combining the best of Hollywood and China really makes for a winning formula. And I think that's what we're intending to do. It's the difficulty, of course, is finding the right subject matter and executing it in a way that pleases countries on both sides of the Pacific. But we believe this is just the beginning of what the future will look like.
Janet, we'll get on to content in a minute. Peter, I want to talk to you about business sense here. You know, we're seeing a lot more deals between China and Hollywood. The Wonder Group, for example, big property empire, buying the AMC cinema chain. Also, investments into production companies like Legendary. Is this increasingly making business sense for Chinese companies to link themselves to Hollywood?
Absolutely. Look, I think just this weekend alone in China, the box office, we see that there's no limits to what the box office will do if the entertainment is right. And as China is only capable of producing up to a certain level, it makes sense that they want to diversify. They want to have access to Hollywood talent, Hollywood content, and the companies that know how to do it.
It's an expensive business, though, Janet, making a movie, and not always a profitable one. How do you make hits for a Chinese audience out of Hollywood and a global one?
You need a lot of cultural sensitivity. You need to really study the marketplace and look at what they're attracted to. You know, what's interesting about the Chinese market is very enviable. The audience likes movies of all kinds, all different genres. They've embraced a lot of Hollywood movies, a lot of local movies. So there's really quite a wide spectrum to choose from. I think the key is making sure that both audiences are pleased. And what I find interesting is that Hollywood is, you know, America is still #1 market and perhaps soon to be #2, almost definitely. But it's still a very large market, and China now is a #2, but also growing. So it makes sense that Chinese companies, which are growing rapidly, want to be able to also access the American market, just as American companies want to access the Chinese one. Why give up the second largest market, you know, even though you may have the first?
But it is about finding the magic formula, isn't it, Peter? For example, Kung Fu Panda 3 did extremely well with the tie-up there we're just talking about with Oriental DreamWorks and DreamWorks. But then we have homegrown hits like Monster Hunt, for example. Was it $380 million in China and barely tens of thousands here in the US, despite lots of effort to push it? What's behind that?
Well, I would say that, first of all, the advertising is not ideal. Look, when you're in China, you make a very, very good film. There's a freshness factor. But when you take a movie like Monster Hunt, which is very, very fresh and interesting by Chinese standards, but by Hollywood standards is a pretty good film. But then it's got to compete with lots of other things. So for this kind of specialized Chinese film that's going to do very well in China and do very well in North America, which has always been a somewhat a parochial market when it comes to language, you have to be extraordinary. You have to overcome lots of barriers. So it's not quite there yet, but I trust that in given time it will be.
Janet, you wanted to pick up?
Well, I was just going to say, by the way, Monster Hunt has already been beaten by another movie called The Mermaid. So that's just, it's every weekend practically there's record-breaking news.
You know, what does the Hollywood executive, Janet, have to understand about the Chinese market? Because you can imagine on the profit and loss sheet, they see the booming Chinese audience. They say, look, we've got to get in here. This is a no-brainer. But then it's difficult necessarily to get the hit. So what would you say to Hollywood audiences about who's watching movies, why and how?
I think, first of all, it involves a level of humility to really get to a place where you can listen and receive, because Hollywood has dominated this industry for so long, and it's very natural for a lot of people to feel like, oh, we know how to do this. This is what we do, and we've done it better than everyone in the past. So it's really being extremely humble and being extremely sensitive, and then looking at certain factors. I mean, one of the fascinating phenomenon right now is that the tickets are sold primarily through group online ticket sales. So you have these companies that are buying vast numbers of tickets and then creating promotions and group ticket sales, and this is a way to motivate Chinese to go to, you know, the theater even more. And then you look at things like the different genres and you know, the Monster Hunts and Pancakes Man. I think it would be very difficult for a Westerner to make that kind of movie, frankly, at the moment, but trying to understand what is appealing about those movies, and then incorporating some of that in the projects, and looking very closely at which stars are very appealing, and also social media is intensely important. They don't spend nearly as much money on marketing because they don't have to. So they have the free promotion through social media, and that is hugely influential.
Janet, you come up with a good point. And Peter, she mentioned humility and Hollywood in the same sentence, not something you often hear about when it comes to addressing new audiences. But in China, it is very different in the way movies are promoted and distributed. I was quite amazed researching for this show how, the big three technology companies like Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent have really got their hooks around how to sell tickets to young people, where they go, the promoting across social media. Has Hollywood got a lot to learn about the sort of new dynamic 21st century Chinese market?
Absolutely. When you talk about Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, otherwise known as BAT, look, these are technology companies that are quite advanced, and they're in the mainstream entertainment business in China, whereas you don't have Google or Facebook and other comparable Western technology companies having the same position in the marketplace. So indeed, Hollywood could learn a few things from how China is really creating an industry based on the trends of today as opposed to yesterday. And part of it is they have nothing to defend. As they're creating this business right in front of our eyes, that they could be where the consumers are at today. So these are some of the things that I think will shape how the world approaches this industry. But as we're talking about the success of China, let me just be the naysayer in the room that in as much as the success has been amazing and overwhelming for the top 10% of Chinese films that actually do make money, 90% of them don't make money. And these are not the stories that we're hearing about. It's an incredibly challenging and competitive marketplace. And when you look at these grosses, we need to remember that the Chinese box office is driven, the revenue is driven 90% by box office in China, whereas in the rest of the world it's about 35%. There's a lot of things that China needs to develop to go to the next step, including developing secondary markets in addition to box office.
Janet, you were going to say that a lot of films also lose money in Hollywood, I presume?
Yeah, I was just going to say that's pretty classic, that ratio of about 10% of the films making money. That's nothing new. I think what's staggering about China, though, is just how much money the profit margin on those successful films is huge. Because
Monster Hunt being a great example, yeah?
Yeah, you could make a film for, in the tens of millions and make hundreds and hundreds of millions, and that doesn't happen that much here. I agree with Peter that the ancillary markets in China need to develop, but that to me shows that there's so much more room for growth. And there are so many surprises all the time. I think we all watch. Nobody really has the crystal ball, but growth, I think, is in the future for some time to come, for sure.
Question to you both, Janet, first. One thing that stood out to me is content is king, and everyone understands that. But distribution could be queen. And the distribution in China is difficult. And a lot of these tie-ins, do they get around the limits of foreign movies if you co-produce with a Chinese company being accessed? Because there's not a lot of foreign movies allowed into China every year. How many is it? Is it 30-something?
Yeah, 34 on a revenue sharing basis. The studios are obviously vying for those spaces, and they put forth their biggest movies. But you're absolutely right that distribution, although they are building theaters, new screens pop up every day in China, every day. There's still a mad rush and competition for getting those screens. Getting the screens is turning out to be one of the most important factors. You want to grab as many screens as you can in that first weekend. So the reason for co-productions, one of the several reasons, is that you can be released, those co-production films can be released during holiday seasons, and you get a better share of the box office than you would if you were a pure Western film being imported, if you can even get one of those slots. And that's why I think there's life.
And Kung Fu Panda 3 did right at the Chinese New Year, which was perfect for that launch, Peter. I want you to pick up with something that Janet just said about the explosion of movie theaters. 50 new movie theaters a day in China. Wow. That is just so big. How is content going to keep up with that demand?
Well, the good news is it's already keeping up, and I think several years ago it was the secondary or the third-tiered cities. Now is the fourth and fifth-tiered cities. Look, China, by Western standards, is still incredibly underscreened. So there's a tremendous growth, and we see that as movies go to smaller Chinese towns, people are discovering them all over again. So it's really quite tremendous, and I think it'll continue to grow.
Janet, you've worked in Hollywood, and you know what a big brand Hollywood is. Look, most people around the planet have heard of John Wayne before they hear of John Woo. It's been a huge, huge soft power machine for US and its supposed values and everything. Can that happen to China?
For myself, I believe it not only can happen, but it will happen. And it's a unique and extraordinary opportunity that presents itself at this moment in time, where people are very interested in seeing more Chinese stories, want to understand how the Chinese mind works. And it's an opportunity for China to be more in the public eye and to shape the image of Chinese and Asians in general, and really sort of tilt an axis in another way. I believe very much in the power of movies because it strikes people at a very subconscious psychological level. And I just think seeing stories that have more Chinese characters, it can only be good for mutual understanding. I think there's been a big wall, so to speak, between what has been allowed on screen in the past, and I think China's about to change that. And I, for one, am very much looking forward to both participating and being an observer of what's to come.
Peter, this is not just a Hollywood-China thing. This is a global thing, isn't it? We're seeing Pinewood Studios, for example, in the UK, famous for James Bond and Star Wars launch projects in China. All these tie-ins that we're seeing globally, and we haven't even mentioned Bollywood, of course, which, of course, is the biggest outside Hollywood when it comes to international films, India. How does China make global hits going forward?
Well, that's a very, very good question, and I know this is something that's causing a lot of folks in China to scratch their heads, and I think part of it, and Janet began to talk about it a little bit, is really incorporating folks who have worked in the global space for some time, and I think we're already seeing that happen in real time, whether it's getting screenwriters with the ability or the experience to write for a global marketplace, getting technologies involved that create a slicker, better look. So, and then accessing global distribution channels, whether it's through acquisition or through the strength of the product. We're seeing all of that happen in real time. I think this is where we're starting to see a public-private partnership in China as well, whereas the government, the private sector, and the creative artists all want the same thing. So a lot of people are scratching their heads, and there's a lot of experimentation going on, and many of us are involved in that process.
Last question to both of you. All this leads, of course, the ultimate accolade that every movie maker wants. Peter, then Janet. When is a Chinese-made film going to win an Oscar?
I would say it has already happened with Ang Lee, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. At least that was a Chinese language film, and that was an Oscar winner. So in my view, it's kind of already happened, and I think there's going to be one that is not necessarily associated with Taiwan, as Ang Lee is thought to be, but coming out of mainland China. And I think, look, it's going to happen, just a matter of time.
Janet, you've got your finger on the pulse of Hollywood. When's China's film going to get an Oscar?
First of all, I think a lot of things might happen before that Chinese film wins an Oscar. For instance, we're going to see Chinese Jedis in the new Star Wars movie. We're going to see more Chinese characters popping up in international movies. And then gradually, I think these worlds are just going to kind of fuse together, and soon it won't even be that obvious what's a Chinese film and what's a Western film. There's a new film that Zhang Yimou is coming out with early next year, which stars Matt Damon, called The Great Wall. So
is that the one with the aliens invading China?
It's called, yes, it's called The Great Wall, and there's a lot of anticipation about that. It's so it's going to be a film with a Chinese feel, Chinese characteristics, maybe Chinese actors, maybe a Chinese director. It's hard to say exactly what that will be, but it will just be a better integration of Chinese elements into global films. That is my prediction.
Janet Young, thanks so much for joining us. Peter Shao, that's all we have time for. To learn more about China's growing film industry, be sure to log on to our website, ccv-america.com. I'm Nathan King, Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.